Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. I want to introduce you tonight again to the chief economist at the Institute of Fiscal Studies and Democracy at the University of Ottawa, Mostafa Askari. I've had the privilege of interviewing him previously, and given the federal budget that was announced last week, I thought it'd be great to check back in with him and see if we're on a reasonable path. Welcome back to the show, sir. How are you?
Thank you very much. I'm very well. Thank you for having me.
My pleasure. So let me go right back to the last show. I remember your final comment last time: as long as they don't institute dental care and pharmacare, you think things are going to work out okay from a fiscal standpoint. Where are you now? Are we sustainable from a financial standpoint, or are the current efforts and the massive increases in industrial strategy, the deficits that I think larger than anyone expected, going to be problematic for us in the future?
I think there are two ways of looking at this. First of all, sustainability, what we normally look at is the long-term sustainability, which essentially the way it is looked at is that if in the long run it doesn't mean 5 years, it means 25 years, 50 years from now. If the expectation is that the amount of debt that we are accumulating relative to the size of our economy is declining over time. If that is the case, then we consider that sustainable. That is, that we are not going to get into a situation where we'll lose credibility in the financial markets and we have to pay higher interest rates for our debt. Now, in the current context, what I can see in the budget, now the dental care is an issue, but dental care is not a significantly large program, although they have added to it to some extent, and the cost estimate that they have right now is somewhat higher than what they had at the time of the fiscal update in the fall. It's relatively small relative to the size of the economy, and pharmacare is not there at all, and they don't even talk about the pharmacare in the document really. And I don't really expect the government actually to do anything on pharmacare because it's a very complicated and expensive program. It requires cooperation from all provinces. It requires cooperation from the private sector. It's really not something easy to implement, and I don't think the federal government really wants to do this. Did
they agree to do it with the NDP?
Well, there is an agreement, but my sense is that they're not gonna honor that part of the agreement really, because as I said, it's just too expensive and too complicated. And first of all, the provinces don't want it, and if the provinces don't want it, then it's not going to be possible to do it actually. Because I mean, you have to have them on site. So that's that. Now, you're absolutely right. The deficit is higher than what people expected and what they showed at the time of the fiscal update. There are obviously a couple of reasons for that. One is that the economy is much weaker than what they had expected at the time, or the private sector had expected at the time. The other thing is that they're introducing new measures, and one of them is essentially an increase in the dental care program, and also they have other measures like the tax credits for the clean economy and a bunch of stuff in there that are about $20 billion over the 5 years. That's the cost. So overall, what we are seeing is that, and then about 22 billion of that is the transfer to provinces for Canada Health Transfer, which everybody knew about it, and this was done before the budget, and there was a lot of pressure on the federal government to actually do something on the health transfer, and they finally agreed to do it. But unfortunately, from the fiscal point of view, the federal government, and most of that money that they are transferring to provinces is not permanent increase. It's just for a temporary increase in those transfers based on a bilateral agreement with each province. So over the long run, even that item of the thing should not really affect their sustainability that much, because as I said, it's not a permanent program. So once that period of whatever 6 years that they have for that $20 billion for provinces, then that is going to come off, and this Canada Health Transfer will go back to its normal trend.
So bottom line, Are you happy or scared?
Well, happy or scared is like, I guess it's, no, I'm not scared, definitely. I think there are things that they could have done. There are things that they are claiming that they are doing and in their numbers that I think are exaggerated. For example, I think their deficit numbers are going to be higher than what they are showing in their tables. Their economy was much weaker than they expected, but the impact of that weakness on the revenue side is not really shown properly. On the other hand, they are putting in place some measures on the tax side. For example, minimum tax for high income earners, and those kind of things. They have booked more money that we think normally they can get from those kind of measures. So overall, my sense is that the revenue projection is somewhat exaggerated and optimistic, which means that the bottom line would be somewhat worse than what they're showing.
We're chatting tonight with Mostafa Askari. He is the chief economist at the Institute of Fiscal Studies and Democracy at the University of Ottawa. We're going to take a break for some messages and be back and go into greater detail on things like the industrial strategy for climate change, the health transfers, interest rates, etc. Stay with us, everyone. We'll be back in just 2 minutes talking about the Canadian federal budget tonight. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. The topic of our discussion tonight is the federal budget, the fiscal plan for Canada. My guest is Dr. Mostafa Askari. He is the chief economist at the Institute of Fiscal Studies and Democracy at the University of Ottawa. He was the deputy parliamentary budget officer at the Parliament of Canada for over 10 years. Before that, he was a director in the Applied Research and Analysis Directorate of Health Canada and a senior chief in the Department of Finance for 18 years. Can you imagine being in government for, that's like 22 years in total that you spent in government? No, more. 32 years that you spent in government, 22 in the departments, and then almost 11 years as the deputy parliamentary budget officer. Prior to that, he's got a PhD in economics from Queen's University. So we've got the right guy on the show tonight. Dr. Mostafa, we've got inflation that is sky high, far higher than anyone was anticipating. And because of that, the central bank has been raising interest rates to try to slow down the economy. You got a PhD in economics. I only got a bachelor's in economics. So you're the smart guy. I'm not. But I thought I learned from smart guys like you that if you ran massive deficits, it would add inflationary pressures to the economy. Isn't the government doing the exact opposite thing than the Bank of Canada is trying to do and making the Bank of Canada's job far more difficult?
Well, in principle, absolutely. I think always fiscal policy and monetary policy, they have to work together in a sense that what one does should not really try to offset the efforts and of the other entity. And in general, yes, if you have a deficit financing of expenditure, you're adding to demand in the economy, and that higher demand obviously puts pressure on prices. Now, in the current context, the post-pandemic situation, I think there are somewhat different issues we are facing. Is that this inflationary pressures and the situation is actually worldwide. It's not something like it's created domestically. We came out of a pandemic with a significant supply chain problem.
But Pierre Poilievre, the leader of the official opposition, His Majesty's official opposition, I love to say that for some reason, he says it's just inflation. It's all about Justin.
Yeah, but one, you have to look at the other countries around us. Look at the US, look at Europe. They're actually they're experiencing much higher inflation than we are.
No, Justin Trudeau is a lot more powerful than I thought. He's caused inflation elsewhere.
That's right. Well, that obviously cannot happen. Now, there is no doubt there are three elements actually that caused inflation really. Because we went through a fiscal deficit for a number of years, even before pandemic, and inflation was about 2%. It didn't really happen now, although when the liberals came to power, they started actually spending much more money than the previous government. But that did not really have much impact on inflation. So again, you have to look at the current context, exactly what was happening in the post-pandemic situation. There are three things. One is the supply chain issues. The other one is that oil prices significantly went up. And again, that's an international global issue. And then the war in Ukraine, which exacerbated the supply chain problem and added to the prices of commodity prices. So all that together resulted in this inflationary situation all across the world, in fact, not only in Canada. Now, on the other hand, and at the same time, what we are seeing is that, in fact, the decline, the improvement in the inflation rate since the start post-pandemic actually has been much better in Canada than in other countries. We are now, the last month, the number was 5.2%, whereas in the US is closer to 9-10%. Now, the only issue that is really affecting people significantly, and this is something I don't think the government can do anything about other than providing some relief through GST tax credit, is food prices. The food prices are going at 9-10%. And that obviously is difficult for especially low-income Canadians. And what the government has done is to provide the GST credit, which they did it at the time of the economic and fiscal update in the fall, and then they added to that again in the budget another $2.5 billion. And that's a temporary relief, obviously, just to help low-income Canadians to get a little bit of relief. There's no way one can actually provide relief to everybody and completely compensate the impact of inflation. That's going to be too costly, and in fact, that would be counterproductive to what the Bank of Canada is trying to do.
So what you're saying is that sort of the academic theoretical conclusion that this deficit budget would be inflationary. You're saying it's not going to be inflationary. It's not going to add to inflation, and so therefore the government didn't need to bring down the deficits, given that the Bank of Canada is, I guess, what you're saying, doing its job, slaying the deficit with high interest rates.
No, well, I mean, what I'm saying is that you also have to look at what kind of spending they're doing. I mean, a big part of this budget is about over $20 billion investment in clean energy incentives and direct investment in that area. Now, again, in principle, those kind of investments will actually help the economy in terms of its productivity and its growth. So those things definitely are not going to be inflationary if they turn out to be that way. But there's always an if there. They turn out to be that way. They're not inflationary because they affect the supply in the economy, and as a result, you're not going to say what would be inflationary if you send checks to people freely, like anything else that some provinces have done, in fact, in the past few months, and essentially let people spend more money. But again, that also depends on the magnitude. The magnitude, for example, the GST tax credit is $2.4 billion. It's a big number when you look at it. $2.4 billion. That's a lot of money. But relative to the size of the economy is about 0.1%. So 0.1% is not gonna move any needle anywhere. It's just so small relative to the size of the economy that you're not going to see an impact of that on inflation or anything else. It's just a relief for people who are at that low income level.
Okay, well, I'm a little bit surprised that Keynesian economics doesn't seem to be having an impact, but who knows? I was hoping, frankly, for a reduction in the deficit. I thought that was the right thing to do, given the massive inflation that we've got. And I worry that it will end up being somewhat inflationary, and by definition, then the interest rates that the Canadian Bank of Canada has will end up being higher than they otherwise would be, have to be higher than they otherwise would be, which will hurt people just as much. The only difference is going to be it's going to hurt people that have got debt, and I think a lot of people have got home mortgage debt, et cetera. Anyway, that's another topic. The $20 billion in green tech, climate change initiatives, et cetera, is really industrial strategy, and industrial strategy more than Canada has done in a long time. Some people say, well, we needed to do it because this is what Biden did in the United States. Other people have said, no, this is a made in Canada industrial strategy, and that's wonderful. And other people have said industrial strategies have never worked. And why are we thinking that we can now pick winners when we haven't done it successfully in the past? What's your opinion, sir, on this huge commitment to industrial strategy in green tech?
When we look at the situation, what Americans are doing and what the Europeans are doing in those areas, we cannot ignore that, because there is always competition for investment. There's always competition for bringing investment into the country. And in some cases, you have no choice but to respond to what your neighbors and what your trade partners are doing. And at the same time, this government has been, since the beginning, has been focused on the net zero and the clean economy, clean energy, and the climate issues. So it's not surprising that they are actually going in that direction. Now, we do have, as part of the climate, the fight against the climate change, we have the tax on carbon that a lot of people don't like, including the opposition parties, one opposition party. But that's one element of that approach. But they also need to do other things. If they really wanted to, if we really want to reach net zero, if we really want to electrify the system and reduce the CO2 emissions in Canada, we need more than what the carbon tax is doing. We need to invest, we need to innovate, and those kind of things sometimes require incentives for the private sector to come in. It can't be done by the government. It has to be, a lot of it has to be done by the private sector. And the private sector in some cases requires incentives to move their operations here rather than in Berlin, or rather than in Washington or on any other place. So again, it's a response that to some extent what the government was forced to do, and also it is consistent with their general approach and general ideology in this area. Now, whether or not this is going to have the positive impact they're hoping, that remains to be seen. There's always an uncertainty. There's always a risk that those kind of tax credits that they're providing may not be enough, and there may be other issues that they're going to face, and that industrial strategy may not work. But overall, I think if we really, as a country, if we really think that climate change is a problem and we have to deal with it, if we think that requires investment, the government has a role to play. Now, that role to play means that it's going to cost money. One of the things that we have always said from our sort of the institute, and myself and my colleagues have been talking about this, that these kind of things cost money, and the government that wants to do this has to be, and the Canadians, they have to be prepared to pay for it, which means that you have to pay more taxes if we really want to do this. If we don't do that, and the government wants to do it, then the only other option the government has is that to deficit finance it. Now, let me just make one comment about what you said earlier about that you wanted to see a lower deficit, and I think I would like to see a lower deficit as well. The question is that we always have to, when people, especially some politicians, when they come out and say the government has to cut the spending, the next question they need to answer is that, what would they cut? And when I look at the government operations and the government budget, about 55% of government budget is transferred, the spending is transferred to people and provinces. Now, those transfers, the biggest item there is always security payments. The second biggest item is health transfer to provinces. Are we going to cut those? What are the consequences of those? These are the kind of things one has to take into account when people look at this and say, well, okay, we have to show a balanced budget. First of all, a balanced budget by itself, a zero number, has really no meaning, to be honest with you, in overall picture. But anyway, reduce the spending and a sort of a prudent fiscal track and sustainable fiscal situation. Those are all good things. But again, we have to look at the trade-off and what is it that we are trying to achieve. Is because cutting is easy. I mean, we did it in the early 90s when we had a fiscal problem, significant fiscal problem. We did it, and it was tough. It was hurtful. A lot of people suffered from that, but it had to be done, and the government did it at the time, and then later on they came out of it. But right now, again, I'm looking at is about 22 billion of that deficit, that spending was health transfer. Now, with all the problems that we have in the healthcare in Canada, are we going to cut that? And if we cut that, then provinces have to increase their spending, because somehow, somewhere, somebody has to cover those kind of, has to provide those services. And the provinces obviously are not willing to raise taxes on their own and fix the healthcare problem. So the federal government was forced essentially to come in and provide that money. So again, yeah, if we didn't have that, the spending would have been $22 billion lower. But that would have certainly helped the bottom line. But is that what we wanted? I think that's the question that everybody has to answer.
We're chatting tonight with Mostafa Askari. He is the chief economist at the Institute of Fiscal Studies and Democracy at the University of Ottawa. He spent over 30 years in federal government, the last over 10 as deputy parliamentary budget officer. So he knows budgets probably better than anybody. We're going to take a break for some messages and come back with Dr. Askari in Askari. I apologize, in just 2 minutes. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. Our topic tonight is the Canadian federal budget that came out last week. Our guest is Dr. Mostafa Askari. He is the chief economist at the Institute of Fiscal Studies and Democracy at the University of Ottawa. He was the deputy parliamentary budget officer for the federal government. Before that, he was a director of general applied research and analysis at Health Canada. And before that, he was a senior chief in the Department of Finance for 18 years. He's got a PhD in economics from Queen's University, and he's been nice enough to chat with me a few times on our show to educate us on some of the issues in regards to the Canadian budget situation. Dr. Askari, I wonder if we could turn to a couple of other topics just for a minute here. Military spending. We've got this obligation in NATO to spend 2% of our GDP in the military. A lot of people are saying that, number one, we're not spending it. Number two, we should be spending that and more given a war in Ukraine and the sorry state of our military, frigates and aircraft and helicopters and armaments, etc. What do you think about that?
I think we definitely have a problem on the defense side for procurement. I mean, what I mean by procurement is that we have had for over 15 years, we have been trying to replace our fighter jets. We've been trying to replace our ships, Navy ships. And unfortunately, none of that has come yet. I mean, for different reasons, different governments, both liberals and conservative governments. They failed to execute. They failed to procure what military needed. And I agree, this is a problem for our military. They are losing capacity. They probably are not prepared to get involved in any kind of military operation at the level that they would like to, at the level that other countries have the capacity to do. So we do have a problem, no doubt. And now, recently, we have heard that the government is finally going back to buy the fighter jets that the military needed, our Air Force needed, and the meeting with Mr. Biden, President Biden, also sort of, I guess, part of that was about that. They had to buy some of those fighter jets very quickly, which is a good thing from that point of view, that the military is getting something from that. Now, again, this goes back to the idea of what's our fiscal capacity to do this, and that goes back to the issue that, okay, we need to get involved. We need to do more on that side. That's going to cost money. Is Canada, we as a country, are we prepared to pay for that? Are we going to actually cut healthcare and spend on military, or are we willing to actually accept higher taxes and pay for military? So those are the kind of trade-offs and issues that people have to take into account when they discuss this kind of thing. There's no doubt that our military needs more interjection of funds and procurement and hiring of new people and buying more equipment. But those are very, very expensive. And one of the issues, of course, I should say that the government is not sort of innocent in this, that the execution and implementation of the problem and the program has not been very great in recently yet, for a long time. And so when we have an agreement and we set aside funds for certain things like Navy ships or things, the procurement process, the different steps that they have to take, that bureaucracy does not allow that thing to go at a pace that is required. So we see the delays, and what the delays means that people or the military is not getting what it needs. So that's another part the government can focus on, is the execution, is the implementation of the programs, and that part definitely the government can do much better than what they are doing.
You mentioned how much money goes to old age pensioners, old age support before the break. Have you been watching what President Macron has been trying to do in France? And does anything like that make any sense, or is it politically impossible? And maybe describe, if you could, what he's actually trying to do.
Well, he's just trying to increase the age for being eligible for pension by 2 years in France, which is still much lower than ours. I think that he wants to do it from 60 to 62. We already have 65. Prime Minister Harper raised that to 67, but the new government, as part of their election promise when they got elected, was that they're going to repeal that, put it back to 65. I think in principle, given the higher life expectancy and the fact that most people actually work beyond the age of 65, I'm working beyond the age of 65, and I don't think there is a major problem in principle to raise that retirement age. And that would certainly help to some extent on the cost of old age security payments. And again, in general, I think it's not a bad idea to do that. Politically, whether it is possible or not, I mean, I don't think the same kind of reaction that we see in France, we are going to see here in Canada. I mean, it didn't happen when Prime Minister Harper raised that age from 65 to 67. Yeah, I mean, some people obviously complained from the seniors associations and those kind of people, but it wasn't really that significant. I mean, it went through, it was implemented, but then obviously the current government changed that again.
Was that a mistake?
Changing it? But you're going back to 65? In principle, if I put my economist hat on, yes, it was a mistake. I think we don't really need. I think 65 was picked and chosen when the life expectancy was 75 years or 70 years. Now we are at 85, 89 year life expectancy. So it's a different kind of environment. People would like to retire at the earlier age. Yeah, there are some people do it, and some people can manage it.
Freedom 55.
But again, as a country,
Freedom 55.
Freedom 55. That's right. Some people like it. Some people like me, they don't want to retire. But so I mean, but overall, in principle, I don't think it's a bad idea to raise that retirement age.
Instead of raising the retirement age, I guess we have built in some incentives to delay actually taking some of your old age allotments. Are those incentives that provide incentives for people to delay actually a good structure? Do they make economic sense? And is that a different way of potentially saving some money?
Well, incentives to delay. I'm just trying to think of what would be a way of doing that. I mean, you were mentioning that. I can't think of anything that.
Well, what we have as a system right now is if you delay getting some of your pension allotments to 70, you actually get more money after 70, but you don't get any money between 65 and 70. And I think the way that the graphs I've seen show is that clearly you're worse off for the first 7 years or so, but then after something like 73 or 75, you've got a break even. So if you think you're going to actually live beyond 75, then you should delay getting your old age until 70 because you get more money after 75. But if you're going to die before 75, you get the money as quick as you can.
That's right. Well, I think something like that could have some impact, obviously. But I've talked to some of my friends that are my age group, and most of them believe that you don't want to delay anything. Money that is available, you should get it rather than waiting for the future. But again, that is just the reactions of some people. It's certainly, I mean, if you actually do the calculation, it's probably beneficial over your lifetime if you delay it, if you can delay it, and you have the capacity and you can afford to delay it. It may be beneficial financially, but I'm not sure those kind of things have a huge impact on an overall spending. I mean, they may have some small negative impact, but I don't see that's going to have significant impact, because most people actually are not going to wait, because a lot of the seniors that actually get old age security, by the way, the old age security is income tested. So most of the people that actually get that money are at the lower sort of the income level. And those people cannot wait, probably. So they're going to start getting it right away.
Okay, health. You've talked about how some of the incremental healthcare spending is of a temporary nature rather than a permanent nature. To make real good changes, don't we need permanent funding? And then some people in the last week have been saying that all of this, big funding of provincial transfers to provinces of healthcare is the wrong thing. What we should be doing is transferring tax points and giving the provinces the ability to actually get their own tax revenue to fund their own healthcare issues. What do you think the solution is with healthcare funding, sir?
There are two ways of doing it. One is the tax point that you mentioned, and if the federal government can convince provinces to take over the healthcare completely and take tax points, which means that the federal government reduce taxes and the provinces will have to raise their own taxes to cover for that amount of transfer that the federal government is doing. That would be one solution, which will take federal government completely out of this game. And the provinces then will have the full responsibility and probably even more flexibility in that case to structure their healthcare system the way that they want to, without any kind of a the influence or restriction from the federal government. Now, in principle, I think that would work for the federal government. It would be harder for provinces because they have to raise their taxes, and politically, obviously, that's not an easy thing to do for every one of those provinces. So there is that political issue there that they may not allow that to go ahead. The other side of this is that I mentioned earlier, our provinces are responsible for providing healthcare. Now, they have, some of them, especially the larger provinces like Ontario and Quebec and Alberta, have the financial capacity to do more in that area. Both Ontario and Quebec are now in a much better fiscal situation than they were 10 years ago or 5 years ago. And they have the capacity, if they want to raise more funds for healthcare. Now, waiting for the federal government, to me, and saying that, well, we can't really fix the current problem because federal government has to transfer money, to me, that's not a good excuse, because they have the capacity to deal with it. I remember, a few months ago when everybody was talking about that the hospitals are they don't have capacity, there are not enough beds, there are not enough doctors, we need to hire nurses, and the provinces like Ontario, Quebec, Alberta were saying that, well, federal government has to provide the funding so we can meet the... No, they had the capacity to do that. They could borrow money. They could raise taxes to do that. So that's a bad excuse as far as I'm concerned. Now, as a country, yes, certainly one can think of this, okay, we have to share the burden of this nationally and provincially. And that's what the federal government is trying to do. Whether that amount is what the provinces want, that's a different issue. That's subject to negotiation. But there's really no formula for that say, well, the federal government has to provide 35%, 40%, or 25%. It's just a number. It is really nothing there to tell me that federal government has to provide 35%. Why? It's not clear. Why would that be the case? One other issue, let me go back to the fiscal aspect of this. Right now, federal government fiscally has a AAA rating in its borrowing, which is the highest rating that you can get on the bond rating agency, which means that the interest that they pay on their debt is lower. Now, some of the provinces, not the bigger one, but some of the other provinces have a lower rating, but that's fine. Now, if the federal government gets its spending and its fiscal situation gets out of hand and gets into an unsustainable fiscal situation by providing significantly more money to provinces and those kind of things, then we are going to see a downward downgrading of our bond rates. And that, if the federal government loses its AAA rating, it's going to affect every other province. Because there is always a gap between the rate of interest that the provinces pay on their bonds and the rate of interest that the federal government pays. And that gap is going to very likely is going to stay. And if the federal government interest that they pay on their debt goes up, those things. So provinces are going to actually not going to benefit from that. So that's another issue one has to take into account. We want the federal government to be sustainable, to have that fiscal credibility financially in the global market. We don't want to lose that.
We sure want the federal government to be fiscally sustainable. There's no question about that. We're chatting tonight with Dr. Mostafa Askari. He is the chief economist at the Institute of Fiscal Studies and Democracy at the University of Ottawa. We're going to take a final break and come back with some concluding comments in just 2 minutes. Everybody stay with us. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. My guest tonight is Dr. Mostafa Askari, the chief economist at the Institute of Fiscal Studies and Democracy at University of Ottawa. He's been, for the last 30 plus years, involved in the federal government as deputy parliamentary budget officer, etc. Doctor, we've got high inflation. We've got high interest rates. We've got high housing prices. We've got banks that are having some financial challenges, and the Fed in the United States and the appropriate agencies in Canada have had to step in. We've got anemic productivity growth. low GDP growth, real incomes haven't been growing. What's going on?
Well, I think the anemic productivity growth has been there for a while, and it's not. I mean, if people always talk about pandemic, but this is not a pandemic issue. This has been going on in Canada and in other Western countries. I think we were used to having high productivity growth in Western economies, 20 years ago, but the world has changed. The world has changed significantly. We have countries like China, countries like Indonesia. These are the countries that have come into the financial, in the global market, and they are major players. So there's competition out there. There's a movement of production and production activity, economic activity from Western countries to these other countries. So some of that, I always look at that. Some of that is a rebalancing of the global economy, and that rebalancing in terms of both of the labor and production. That rebalancing has consequences, and consequences definitely somewhat negatively for Western countries and industrial countries, and positive for other countries that are new players into the system. And it doesn't mean that we cannot improve our situation, but I think looking at the 30 years ago, 35 years ago, and think that we can always go back to that situation, I think that's a bit of a dream. I think we have to accept that this is a different world. This is a different world, different players, and new competition from other areas. So we have to accept that. You see the standard of living in China has increased significantly. Now, there is that rebalancing is happening. We like it? No, we don't like it, but it's the reality. It's the reality of the situation. Now, again, I'm not saying that there's nothing we can do about any of this. I think we can have the right smart policies domestically to make sure that we can take advantage of the current situation and improve the standard of living our own citizens. But again, I don't think we that nostalgia of 40 years ago. I think to me that's a dream.
So we can't make Canada great again.
Well, Canada is great. To be honest with you, I think we are fortunate. To be honest, I'm an immigrant in a sense, but we are fortunate in this country. I mean, when I look around in other countries and what other people are doing, and what Canada is and what Canada is offering, I think we are really lucky and fortunate. And we have problems like any other countries, but I think we always have to appreciate what we have.
Dr. Mostafa Askari, thank you so much for joining us tonight, and for putting the budget and some of the challenges in our fiscal situation in perspective. I think it is interesting that you mentioned that there's this rebalancing internationally with the growth of China, Indonesia, India, etc. I think it's going to continue, and I hope it does to a certain extent, with Africa coming more into the global economy than it has in the past, because I do think there's incredible poverty there that needs to be addressed and can be addressed by them more fully participating in the global economy. I do, however, think that there's got to be something that we do to attack our anemic productivity growth and the fact that real median incomes have just not grown in the last 5-10 years in Canada. I don't think that that's a good prognosis for the future. There was a poll that was out just yesterday in the United States. I haven't seen the equivalent in Canada, but I bet the result would be the same. That said that 25 years ago, over 66% of the people thought that their kids would do better. And today it's less than 25%. So people's confidence that the next generation will do better than they have has dropped from more than 2/3 to less than 25%. And I think that is a massive shame if it's true in Canada.
I agree.
And I think we got to change that.
I agree. No, you're absolutely right. I think we do have those kind of problems, and we need certainly to be smarter in our policies.
That's our show for tonight, everybody. Thank you for joining us. I Remind you, I'm on every Monday through Friday at 6 o'clock on 960 AM, and you can stream me online at www.saga960am.ca, even from the University of Ottawa. Dr. Mostafa Askari, thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Brian. It was a pleasure.
Good night, everybody.